Сайн байцгаана уу хүнд үзэгчдээ. Өнөөдөр хороо манай дефакто нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор өнөөдрийн ардчлал, чөлөөт ардчлалын онлын хамгийн том төлөөлөгч, хамгийн том нөлөө бүхий одоо онолч Франсис Фукуяма оролцож байна.
Франсис Фукуяма, Америкийн улс төр судлаач, улс төрийн эдийн засагч, зохиолч Ёшихиро Франсис Фукуяма 1952 онд Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын Иллиной мужийн Чикаго хотод төрсөн. 1992 онд гаргасан түүхийн төгсгөл ба сүүлчийн хүн зохиол нь дэлхийд даяар шууган тарьсан. Корнелийн их сургуульд бакалаврын зэрэг хамгаалсан. Харвардын их сургуульд улс төрийн шинжилгээ ухааны доктор зэрэг хамгаалсан. 1979 онд дэлхийн бодлогын чиглэлээр судалгаа явуулдаг Ранд корпорацид орсон. Жорж Мэйсон их сургууль, Джонс Хопкинс их сургуулиудад багшилж байсан. Одоогоор Стэнфордын их сургуульд ахлах судлаачаар ажиллаж байна. Чөлөө цагаараа фото зураг авах дуртай, эхнэр 3 хүүхэдтэй.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming to this program. We in Mongolia are so happy to see to hear your speech. And you have been staying for a few days in the country. How do you find it so far?
Well, it's fascinating. I think Mongolia is it's a really fascinating moment to be here now because it's the fastest growing economy in the world, which has done very well for a post-communist country, but I think faces really huge challenges in the future. So I'll be watching it very closely once I depart.
Economy is growing not because Mongolians are good. It's just because we have a lot of minerals happen to be. And these minerals, the revenue makes economies growing. But however, there are many people, 1/3 of countries staying poor by World Bank, $2 per day standard, and people are not sure that whether they are benefiting from that huge revenue. And the people are standing now 20 years during this whole transition, economic and political transition. Some people are saying, is it the right way? Is it true that is it really can work in Mongolia, where we had just that communist past quite recently? How you would answer to those people?
Well, you can deal with mineral resources and this kind of sudden wealth if you have a strong government that has the quality to actually use those resources fairly. And I think the big problem with a relatively poor country and with one especially that has this communist past is that there isn't a lot of historical precedent for having that quality government. You know, Norway is the gold standard for dealing with resource wealth because they don't spend the money that they bring in, they put it away in places where the politicians can't get at it. And that system works extremely well, but you get these other examples like Nigeria or Angola where basically those countries would have actually been better off if they had never found oil there at all because of the corruption and the kind of focus of all politics then on getting your hands on these resources that then consumes the whole political life of the country. And so I think that's really the model that you want to avoid. And that, I think, suggests that you have to be a little bit slow and deliberate in the way that you build up the institutions to deal with this new wealth.
So when we talk about strong government, first of all, we talk about the capacity of government institutions doing their job, what they're supposed to do. In particular in this country, we are now suffering not that because lack of laws or rules. We're suffering because of its bad enforcement. And say, let's go you have mentioned about the Norway. In Norway, along with these institutions being strong, also they have innovated that sovereign fund, which they kept separate, but used in only occasionally. Is it the only way to have this sort of revenues having a side, using when you need?
Well, that's not the only way. I think the real issue for any developing country government is whether the government is going to make decisions in an impartial way, meaning that if you decide to help an entire class of people, you're able to do that. You don't just give help to your political supporters, to your friends, to your relatives, to people that just happen to be close to you. And that kind of relationship is almost universal, and it's very hard to avoid because I think it's just human nature to favor people that are close to you or to whom you're related. And so I think something like Norway's Sovereign Wealth Fund is just a procedural mechanism to force people to restrain themselves in the way that they use the money. So there's a clear money audit trail that goes from the oil to the bank to the spending ministry so that people can see where it goes. And then there's an open democratic process by which people decide how are we going to use this money. And then there's a pretty open and transparent government with respect to how you spend that money, so that people see if you allocate so much money for education, it actually gets to the schools and the children that you've allocated the money for. And every one of those steps, and so when I was using the word strong government, I didn't mean authoritarian or being able to put people in jail. Strong government is really quality government, where every one of those steps is transparent and is executed in a way that is perceived as fair by people. And that's really what I think is extremely hard to achieve.
People now like to go to the government nowadays in this country, because somehow people who are associated or close to the government are much better off. And young graduates would prefer to go there. And you were just said about this relations of close people and how to avoid that, how to make such a rule that they don't do it.
Well, I think one thing is you need to have a high quality bureaucracy and a government that's based on merit, and then really strict laws about how much money you can make as a government official. In the United States, if you are ambitious and you want to make a ton of money, you don't go into the government because the salaries are limited. There are all sorts of rules. You cannot have a business on the side if you're a public official. Even trading stocks or using your assets, you're not allowed to do that either as a government official. And so people actually, we have the opposite problem in a way, that we can't get good quality people to go into the government because they can get much richer in the private sector. But I think in the end that's healthier, because the private sector is what generates wealth. It's not the government. And therefore you want ambitious people to go and create wealth in the private sector, and you want people in government to simply be the custodians of that, but not to see that their economic future is going to be by being a corrupt politician.
Okay, that brings to an issue of what kind of businesses the government must and should have, and what should not have.
Well, I think that the way I think about it is that there are certain functions that the government must play, which is what the economists call public goods. That is to say, things that cannot be provided by the private sector because they have no incentive to do that. So, roads, education, national defense, private companies will not provide this and let everyone enjoy them. And so the government really needs to provide those. Law and order, for example, or a legal system that allows people to settle disputes and protects them from,
police, judiciary,
all of these things.
Even the fire department, and even in some cases, some prisons are private.
Well, the people that actually operate the fire department and the prison are private, but it's the government that's still paying for it. And they have to pay for it because nobody is going to pay for a fire department that's going to put out the fire in your neighbor's house, but you're going to have to pay for that. So the government really needs to do that.
So those limited institutions that provide public goods are to be, this is their performance functions will say about the quality of functions of the government, right? in Mongolia, for example, Mongolian Airlines,
Mm-hmm.
completely owned by the government. They say state-owned, etc., but majority, but actually it's owned.
Mhm.
We have a joint venture with the even Russian government,
Mhm.
railways,
Mm-hmm.
one big large copper factory.
Mm-hmm.
How to privatize them?
There you're getting into a different kind of problem, which is operations that are, again, what economists call natural monopolies. So you're not going to build 1 million rail lines that are all going to compete with each other, and an airline, you're probably not going to have, too many of them. And there, I think, you can privatize an airline, but you do need good regulation to make sure that a government monopoly is not simply replaced by a private sector monopoly. You have similar problems with electricity and water that are also, I think, natural monopolies. And you can privatize them, but the government really has to be able to control the private sector operator.
It's also energy issue.
Electricity,
power,
yeah,
yes.
that's right. That's right.
See, some people say that in Mongolia now, the Western Europe, highly developed nations were grown up on private land. Everybody had the land. There was very limited public land, and the border is very clear. And that took several centuries to make clear. And when this state relations and the government functions are based on this sort of relations where everybody has property, then this democracy works, they say. I mean, here, the land is not owned by people. It's given, but this property of the state. In a land, big land, pasture land, and the people keep moving. Without solving these property issues, can we build up this liberal democracy in this country?
Well, that's a very complicated issue, because I think that, there's a Western economic theory that says you have to have individual ownership of land and property to make it productive. And that's true in certain cases, so that under communism, for example, when you had state ownership of, let's say, a factory, it didn't work well because the owners of the factory really didn't have any incentive. They couldn't keep the profits they made, and so they had no incentive to be efficient. But I think that in a place like Mongolia, where still, a significant part of your population are herders that are pastoral nomads that move from place to place, they've actually worked out a kind of traditional system of sharing land, so that you avoid what the economists call the tragedy of the commons, where because there's no private ownership, people just take as much as they can and then destroy it for everyone else. And I don't think that that's the traditional system here in Mongolia. So I would, it's a complicated issue, and it's not necessarily the case that you need private individual ownership in all cases. In the case of a mining concession or a factory, it's going to be different.
Okay, before we go to the second questions that are important for today's Mongolian economy, I would like to ask you about your childhood. You were born to an American Japanese family. Your mother also, your mother is from Japan, right?
She was born in Japan, yes.
And you were, in childhood you were speaking which language in home?
No, I didn't speak any Japanese. I grew up in New York City. In America, at least in my generation, children of immigrant parents didn't want to speak anything but English. So
why?
Because I think, we wanted to be identified as Americans and not as Japanese Americans or something else. These days it's a little bit different. I think people are more interested in cultivating their original ethnic heritage.
Have you studied back then through English your history, background of Japanese?
Well, I only did that as an adult. When I was in graduate school, I took a course from Edwin Reischauer, who was a great scholar of Japan, and I began learning about Japanese history. And then I still have some relatives in Japan, and so I've been there fairly often.
Okay, here we are in dilemma in Mongolia about the character-forming ethics or culture, which is in Japan Bushido. In America, maybe it's this American dream, individual freedom. Do they contradict?
Well, they're different. I think that Bushido is really the samurai ethic that is all about honor. It's closer to a European aristocratic code that says that, you need to sacrifice yourself on behalf of your lord, that you don't give in to, temptations, and you don't do things just for material gain. I think the American ethic is much more bourgeois. It's very based on the individual, and it's very much, in a certain sense, acquisitive and also innovative. I mean, people want to make the best that they can of their lives and have the maximum of freedom. And so I think it's a very different kind of moral system.
Yet this system is keeping the Japan, the country, is going through almost a decade of no growth, but keeps surviving.
Well, it's actually gone on for more than a decade. It's more like 2 decades now. But I'm not so sure that you can trace this to moral factors. I just think that economies, once they get to a certain level of wealth, oftentimes just find it hard to move to the next level. And I think that's where Japan is right now.
Can you share with us your thoughts about the health insurance system in America? There was a famous movie by Moore, I believe, about French system or Canadian system. I have been living in America. I saw the insurance, and without this insurance, you cannot visit even doctor. And there are people who cannot afford. There are 10-20% of the Americans cannot.
Right.
And how do you see from today's point that which one is better?
Oh, I think America's health system is a big embarrassment. I think our healthcare costs per person are twice that of other developed countries, and the results are worse. So I think just the empirical facts, indicate that we have a really inefficient system. And I think the problem is that if you have a job, especially with a big company, you get really good health care. You don't have to worry about it. The problem is if you're unemployed or self-employed or between jobs and you lose your insurance, it's extremely expensive to get it.
Unusually expensive.
Yeah.
And yet in England, even in England, in France, the doctor visits you, and it's free, and they prescribe medicine for you, prescribe, and you go in cheaper. And the social system was even freer here. So today we are in dilemma of selecting these two paths, American and French, Canadian. So still here you think that the French is better?
Well, there are many different intermediate possibilities too. For example, the Swiss or the Dutch have a system in which the insurance is provided privately, but the government still regulates that market and makes sure that everybody has insurance. So, I don't think it's either the American system. I mean, I don't think anyone would choose the American system deliberately, but there's also alternatives to simply state provision of this kind of insurance. But I think that, it's an obligation of governments to make sure that people have access to health insurance, and, it's something very important.
Well, we talked just now about the countries where you said at certain point they have a critical, large, decisive middle class. In the developing countries, even in Mongolia, in transition economies, we don't have that. I mean, in general, poor. So how do you define the word quality middle class? What is this, and how does it come out?
Well, first of all, you have to define what middle class is. I think that it's not just an economic category. Like a lot of economists say, well, you hit a certain level of income and you're middle class. I don't think that's enough. I think it really depends very much on education. And it also, I think, depends on whether you actually own some property, even a car or, some consumer durables, something that you have to worry about, the government taking away from you. But the educational level is probably the most important because, I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that the better educated you are, if you read, if you're connected with the outside world, you just have a different set of expectations about your relationship with the government. You're more demanding, and you see that, you need to enter the public space in order to debate other people and to protect your interests. And so that's why I think that it's important for the long-term success of democracy to have not just a middle class, but actually a system in which, the majority of people are relatively middle class, not too many poor and not too many rich. There are many countries in Latin America, which is a very unequal part of the world, where you have a very small elite and then a mass of, quite poor people, and that's what leads to this conflict between the left and the right. There's a lot of polarization. You have a lot of struggle and bitterness and populism on the one side and very conservative, narrow governments on the other.
Is it also because in Mongolia we have so many political parties, different views, because of that problem?
Well, I'm not sure that the number of parties is so much due to that. My perception, only having been here a few days, is that Mongolian society prior to this big boom was actually fairly equal. That, it's a society of people that were herders, originally not a big industrial sector where people could get very rich. And one of the social problems now is because of mining and these other activities, you now have this opportunity to create a certain part of the society that, gets very rich. And so the polarization may not exist yet, but if you don't pay attention to this, I think, it will come.
What is the best way for people to benefit this huge mining revenue immediately in their daily life?
I don't think that there's a single answer to that, but what I would advise is that the government, needs to, in a sense, put away a lot of that money, for the future. There's a lot of countries that have a lot of either exports or energy, exports, and they get a lot of money coming in, and they put it into a sovereign wealth fund. And the more transparent that is, the better, because you don't want to spend it all too quickly. If you spend it too quickly, that leads to corruption, that leads to big conflicts over, how to spend it. And so I think what you want to do is smooth that path and make sure that, the money that's put away, everybody knows where it is, how much there is in it, and there's some mechanism for agreeing how to spend it.
Do we spend that for infrastructure, education, quality of education to increase?
I think, the most important thing if you want to create a middle class and a more equal society is you have to invest in things that affect the population as a whole. One of the problems with mining is it doesn't create very much employment. And so you need to provide people with the education that will allow them to get jobs in a more modern sector. You do need infrastructure to allow them to communicate, to export, and other things.
And yet we talk about now, with the mining revenue, we need to diversify the economy, meaning that to create new sectors or to continue growing in sectors. And here we have been discussing about the cluster competitiveness issue that what Harvard University is explaining, and you made your PhD at Harvard. What do you think about Michael Porter's theory about the cluster for competitiveness?
It's true that there are clusters that grow up that become important sources of economic growth, but the problem is, does the government, and in particular the Mongolian government, have the wisdom and the ability to actually create a cluster? So in general, I think it's right that you need to diversify out of just extractive industries, but what else are you going to do? And that's the point at which governments are very limited. You can't, I think, create an automobile industry or a semiconductor industry, things of that sort. And so I think that it's probably better, in a sense, simply to provide, the skills, the training, the infrastructure And then if there's a non-mining cluster that emerges, it'll probably happen on its own due to market forces or due to the free choices of individuals. When the government gets into the business of pushing a certain cluster, that's when you get into trouble.
Exactly. It is either to be a partnership or more private sector led, like Chile did after Pinochet, or during Pinochet they started. Yet now we talk about the size of the government, and one of your famous book about building this state. In that context, what is the optimal size of the government? Can we define some mathematically or somehow?
Well, I don't think you can define it mathematically, but the size, the possible size of the government depends very much on its quality. In Scandinavia, countries like Denmark or Sweden have 60% of the GDP goes through the government. It's taken in tax revenue, but the governments there are very high quality, and so they provide a lot of services in return for all that tax money, and so there's no problem, and people are happy with that system. But there's almost no other part of the world that has that quality government. In most other parts of the world, if the government took 60% of the whole economy, they just waste it, or it would go into corruption.
Like Mongolia would go with 50% now.
Yeah.
Everybody promising less and less, but actually they keep increasing.
Yeah.
And more than that, we have always a deficit. Today the deficit of the budget is 10% of our GDP equal. You remember the Greece 14% and they lost it almost.
That's right.
So that's the big worry of Mongolians now. We have a too big government, less efficient, nothing to do, nothing close to this Scandinavian quality. Did you feel it on our road?
No, I think that's right. I mean, just, I guess the biggest impression I had is just traffic in Ulaanbaatar, I mean, the government really needs to provide better infrastructure and a lot of basic services. But again, the ambitiousness of the government really should be limited by what it's actually capable of doing. And if it's not capable of these very ambitious cluster kinds of projects, it should probably stay away from that.
There are few countries in the world which has a law that limits ceiling of the government debt, which is the case of the U.S. And now you recently changed a bit that part. We had the same feel with Russia. We had the same problem of foreign debt, somehow solved, and today our foreign debt keeps growing. For a country like this, how much we can afford to have a foreign debt big?
Right now, it's a complicated question because I think everybody's anticipating future mining revenues that will actually allow you to pay for a lot of this. However, again, this is a risky bet. I mean, everybody assumes that commodity prices are just going to go up, but in the 1990s they were extremely low. China's economy may crash, in the next few years, and commodity prices could, sink down to very low levels again. And so I think a prudent government, keeps its own debt level under control. By the way, the United States doesn't really have a debt ceiling because we've actually been borrowing way too much money. The so-called debt ceiling is only a ceiling on what we agree to pay for past debts. But I think the United States government is in fact not been very responsible with regard to borrowing. It's just because so many people want to use the dollar as a medium of exchange that we've been able to get away with borrowing much more than we really should have.
Speaking about the currency, your currency is the only currency that the whole world trades. And yet you have 5 federal banks, right, central banks, who can print money, dollars again. How this, if U.S. wants one day to do so, they can print as much as they want. What's your consideration of that?
It's a dangerous situation. We've been able to get away with this, again, because the dollar is a global currency and a lot of people want to hold dollars. But I think there will come a time when people lose, for example, right now, the only reason that the dollar is doing well is that the euro is weak, that the Chinese don't allow the renminbi to be traded, and there are really no other global currencies that anyone is able to use. And so by default, they go to the dollar. But that won't always be the case. I mean, at some point, they're going to lose faith in the dollar. There'll be some alternatives in terms of currencies. And at that point, I think we're going to have to pay the price for all of this debt that we've accumulated.
China and Russia were discussing about the alternative, based, energy-based, remember that? And then also to have their monies being convertible. How much does it have a ground?
Well, the Chinese have got a much better chance of doing this than the Russians do, because the Russians really don't produce anything that anyone wants other than oil and gas. China is moving towards that. I mean, they're beginning to allow foreigners to own renminbi accounts. They're beginning to invoice sales in renminbi to some of their customers. And I think they just want to be very cautious, because the moment you internationalize your currency, in a sense, you lose some political control, and I think they're reluctant to do that too quickly. But I think, in 10 years, the renminbi will be much more commonly traded internationally than it is today.
Well, once we talk about this currency, we cannot but touch the euro today, where we are not clear future. Particularly Greece, now Spain declaring the non-capacity of paying debt, government debt keeps increasing. How do you see the future of euro?
Well, I think the euro is going to break apart sooner or later. I think actually Greece should have exited the euro a long time ago, but for reasons of national pride, I think they haven't done that. And it probably means that the euro will go to a smaller, group of countries if that happens, because right now I don't really see the conditions for their solving, their problem of keeping that single currency and yet being able to grow.
So then it will be smaller territory for euro.
Yeah, I think the northern European countries could have the euro because they've all got the budget discipline to do that, but it's some of the southern ones that are more problematic.
Mongolia is trading in almost everything we sell to China. And we are completely dependent on economics in that sense. And people yet, they want to have, for example, they want to, instead of supplying raw materials, let's have in Mongolia, create big industrial complex. Now this government is going to make one complex which may cost about $10 billion. Will consist of cement factory, irons, copper, coking coal, etc. And yet we have no experience, and we are going to put a lot of money to one place to the evaluating of this raw materials. Will China buy it? Will it meet the China? What do you think? Do you know any similar case of a country like Mongolia, which will jump into industry like this immediately? What do you think?
Well, I know a lot of countries that have tried to build an industrial sector quickly and completely failed. I mean, Nigeria, for example, or Ghana both tried to build steel industries that in 20 years cost, billions of dollars and didn't produce a single ton of steel because all of the different inputs to that simply weren't available. So it's a very big risk when the government decides to try to simply create this kind of industrial sector out of nothing. Now, some Asian countries like Japan and Korea actually did promote certain industrial sectors, but they went very deliberately, first into light manufacturing, and when they got more skills in that and a workforce, then they moved into heavy manufacturing and petrochemicals and so forth. But they had a very capable government, and also I think human resources that allowed them to do that. The sufficient numbers of educated people and so forth. So for a very small country like Mongolia, I think it's not easy to do.
It's going to be a big challenge. Before probably doing that, one is to recalculate again. What can we do? Can we provide that quality? Will it will be competing with the current Chinese productions, otherwise transport through China again. Well, let's a few minutes. Let's talk about your famous book about the end of history, and you could call it differently. Why the end of history?
Well, the term "the end of history" comes from the German philosopher Hegel, and it doesn't mean the end of events in that sense. It means the direction of history, end in the sense of the direction of history. It was a term that Karl Marx then adopted, and the communists had a version of the end of history too. They said history is going to move progressively from primitive communism to feudalism to bourgeois capitalism to communism. And so the end of history for the communists was some form of communism. And all I said in my original book and article was that it didn't look like we were going to get to communism, that history was still moving in a certain direction, but it looked like the last point we would get to is liberal democracy. And that was, that was really the argument. And I think that's still the case. I really don't see a higher form of civilization that exists beyond, a market-oriented democracy.
Exactly. So that's why, whether we like or not, this is the best form that brought the best result we want to see. Maybe it is not the ideally best, but it's the whatever we tried.
And I think what you have to do is look around the world and see if there are other very different systems that would be preferable. Right now, some people point to China, but I think that China is really, first of all, not a system that other countries can adopt very easily. And I think also that China is going to undergo tremendous stresses in the next decade, both political and economic. And so it's not clear that their system is one that can sustain itself for a long period of time.
China, whatever happens in China, if they will make one step to in democracy, they have several political parties. I mean, it is the way they have. Then they have. You have to select one of the parties, right? Or do you think there is any alternative?
I think that there's going to be a great deal of demand for greater accountability in China, above all in the environmental area, because the Chinese environment has been so poisoned by this rapid development that many people, feel betrayed in a sense by their government. They're very angry. But whether this will take the form, immediately of a multi-party democracy, I somehow doubt. I think that probably what you'll see is a greater openness within the Communist Party, greater liberalization, people being able to discuss more, and I think probably a very gradual movement towards political freedom. I think, in fact, it's not that easy and in some ways dangerous to move too quickly towards a completely open democratic political system, even though Mongolia actually did that fairly effectively. But Mongolia is a small country.
And the same is talking about Russia, where not much to select. Just a person comes in here too, and then how do you see the democracy in Russia today?
Well, I think that Putin's generation feels very resentful about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they think that the 1990s was a humiliating time of chaos. But I think the younger people in Russia can actually take for granted basic political stability, and I think they want a government that is more responsive and doesn't treat them like children. And that's why I think you're now seeing the growth of, some protests and more political activism in that country.
So within these two contexts of our two neighbors, inside we try to make this political and economic transition simultaneously. When is it the time that we think that we have done this transition?
Well, first of all, I don't think that a transition is ever over. Just because you become a democracy and reach a certain level of wealth doesn't mean that you're going to just be there forever. I mean, look at Greece. Everybody thought that Greece was a successful country, developed, and now it's been slipping back steadily into, really poverty in a certain way. So I don't think anybody can be complacent or relaxed about their institutions, and in that sense, no transition is ever over. Even in the United States, I think, even though it's one of the biggest and first democracies, we have problems with our democracy that need to be fixed, and so...
Having said that, if you were in charge of decision maker in this country, what would be your priority today?
Well, I guess my priority would be strengthening the rule of law in the basic state institutions to make sure that the government can actually act fairly, and especially in dealing with all the new revenues that are going to be coming in. And that means, for example, having an independent judiciary that really has the power to enforce laws impartially without favoring one political party or another. It depends on good information about how the government is operating and acting and so forth. And it means a high quality bureaucracy that can actually do things, enforce laws and so forth.
That's what exactly we try to do now, and happy that to hear that this is exactly the point we have to pay attention. I think our new government, new political power who just took over the positions maybe will have that in mind.
I hope.
And I want you to visit this country, say, another 10 years, and we will continue again what went wrong, what went right.
All right, very good, thank you.
Fukuyama, Dr. Fukuyama, thank you very much for coming to this our show, and we will share it to our audience in Mongolian and hope it will give a lot of food for thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.